There is a strange, quiet truth about human connection that almost nobody talks about openly because it sounds cold when you say it out loud, and yet it explains more about why people fall deeply, obsessively in love than almost anything else you have ever been taught about romance. We grow up believing that love is built through kindness, through constant validation, through making someone feel good every single time they are around us. And on the surface, that sounds right, it sounds warm, it sounds safe. But if you have ever watched someone chase a person who barely gave them attention, or watched a confident, successful person become quietly obsessed with someone who didn't fawn over them, you already know that this simple story about love is incomplete. There is a psychological mechanism buried underneath human attraction that has nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with identity, ego, and the fragile sense of self that every person carries around, whether they admit it or not. This mechanism has been studied in psychology for decades, hidden inside research on self-esteem, validation-seeking behavior, and something called the intermittent reinforcement effect. And once you understand how it actually works, you will never look at attraction the same way again. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why this happens, and more importantly, how it works on a psychological level that most people never even notice is happening to them, and why the people who master this dynamic, whether they know they're doing it or not, become the ones who get chased, missed, thought about at 2 in the morning, and loved with an intensity that calm, constant affection could never produce. Let's start with something almost everyone gets backwards. Most people believe that if you want someone to love you deeply, you need to build them up constantly, compliment them, agree with them, make them feel important every single time you interact. It feels intuitive because it mirrors how we think affection is supposed to work between two adults who care about each other. If you're kind, if you're generous with praise, if you make someone feel good every time they're near you, surely that person will grow to adore you. That's the story most of us were told, whether directly or through the quiet examples of the people around us growing up. But psychologically, constant validation does something unexpected. It flattens the emotional landscape. When a person receives approval every single time, their brain stops registering it as meaningful. This is a basic principle of neuroscience called habituation. The same reason a song you loved on repeat eventually becomes background noise. The same reason a scent you wear every day stops registering to your own nose after a few minutes, even though someone walking past you smells it instantly. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter tied to reward and anticipation, doesn't respond well to predictability. It responds to uncertainty, to fluctuation, to the unexpected. And this is where things get interesting, because ego, that fragile, protected sense of self-worth every person carries, behaves the same way. When someone's ego is constantly stroked, it becomes numb to affection. But when that same ego experiences even a small, controlled challenge, something a person didn't expect, something that makes them pause and question themselves for a second, it triggers a completely different psychological response. It triggers engagement. It triggers focus. It triggers the exact kind of attention that turns a passing interest into something closer to obsession. Now here's where I need you to lean in, because what I'm about to explain is the part almost nobody understands correctly. And if you get this wrong, it can backfire in ways that damage connection instead of deepening it. So keep watching, because in about 60 seconds, I'm going to reveal the one subtle shift that separates healthy, magnetic confidence from something that looks like manipulation and pushes people away completely. And trust me, that difference is razor thin, and almost everyone giving advice on this topic online gets it wrong, misses it entirely, or worse, teaches it in a way that turns people cold and calculating instead of genuinely compelling. Before we get there, though, I want you to think about your own life for a second, because this isn't just theory. This is something you have already lived through, probably more than once, without realizing what was actually happening underneath the surface. Think about a teacher you respected the most growing up. Chances are it wasn't the one who gave everyone an A and told every student their work was brilliant. It was the teacher who was warm, but who also had standards, the one whose approval actually meant something because it wasn't handed out freely. Think about a boss you admired. Probably not the one who praised every single thing you did, regardless of quality, but the one who was fair, occasionally hard to please, and whose rare compliment felt like it actually mattered because it wasn't automatic. This pattern shows up everywhere in human life, not just romance, because it isn't really about romance at all. It's about how the human brain assigns value to things, and approval is no exception to that rule. Here's the deeper psychology behind why challenging someone's ego in the right way creates such a strong emotional pull. Human beings are wired for what psychologists call effort justification. This comes from cognitive dissonance theory, first studied by Leon Festinger in the 1950s, and it explains something fascinating about how our minds protect our self-image. When we have to work for something, when we put in effort, face resistance, or experience even a small setback in pursuit of it, our brain unconsciously increases the perceived value of that thing. This is why people cherish achievements they struggled for far more than things handed to them easily. It is why a promotion you fought for feels more meaningful than one you were simply given. It's why a degree earned through years of late nights and financial strain means more than one paid for outright with no effort involved. And it is precisely why a person who feels slightly challenged, slightly uncertain, slightly unsure whether they have already won someone's affection, will invest more emotional energy trying to secure it. Their ego, that internal narrative of I am capable, I am valuable, I am worthy of respect, gets threatened just enough to demand resolution. And the mind cannot rest until that resolution comes. This is not cruelty. This is not about tearing someone down. It is about understanding that certainty kills desire, while a small, respectful challenge keeps the mind engaged and searching. Think about the last time you felt truly hooked on wanting someone's approval. Chances are it wasn't when they were agreeing with everything you said. It was in the moment they raised an eyebrow at something you claimed, or gently pointed out a flaw in your logic, or didn't immediately react the way you expected. That tiny gap between expectation and reality is where psychological hooks live. Our brains are prediction machines. We are constantly running simulations of how people will respond to us, and when reality doesn't match the simulation, our attention snaps into focus. This is the exact same mechanism that makes cliffhangers in movies and television so addictive. Your brain built a prediction. The prediction was interrupted, and now it needs closure. It cannot look away until it gets that closure. Think about the last show you binged until 3 in the morning. It wasn't because every episode ended peacefully. It was because every episode ended with a small rupture in your prediction, a question left hanging, a piece of information withheld just long enough to keep you reaching for the next episode. Human attraction runs on almost the identical circuitry. This is precisely why the people who feel most unforgettable in our lives are rarely the ones who agreed with everything we said and admired everything we did. They are the ones who occasionally, respectfully, confidently disagreed, who held their own opinion even when it would have been easier to nod along, who didn't collapse into approval-seeking behavior every time tension appeared in a conversation. Now, this is critical, so listen carefully, because this is the line between something psychologically powerful and something that becomes toxic and manipulative. There is a massive difference between challenging someone's ego and attacking their character. Challenging an ego means holding your own perspective, having standards, not rushing to soothe every moment of friction, and allowing someone to sit with a small, harmless uncertainty about how you feel. Attacking someone's character means insults, humiliation, coldness used as punishment, or intentionally making someone feel small to gain power over them. One builds respect, the other builds resentment, fear, and eventually, if it continues, it builds trauma. Real psychological attraction never comes from cruelty. It comes from self-respect. It comes from a person who has clear boundaries, who values their own time and energy enough not to hand out unconditional approval to everyone who wants it, and who allows other people to feel the natural human tension of earning connection rather than being given it freely and instantly. If you take nothing else from this video, take this distinction, because misunderstanding it is exactly how people twist psychology into cruelty and call it strategy, and that is not what this is about. This actually connects to something called scarcity psychology, a concept well documented in behavioral economics and consumer psychology, most famously studied by Robert Cialdini in his research on influence and persuasion. Cialdini found that people assign more value to things that are perceived as limited, rare, or difficult to obtain. This applies to products, opportunities, and yes, to people. Think about why a limited time offer feels more urgent than an item that will always be available. Think about why a job opening with 100 applicants feels more prestigious than one nobody else wanted. The scarcity itself changes the perceived value of the exact same object or opportunity, even when nothing about its actual quality has changed. When someone senses that your attention, approval, or affection is unconditionally available at all times, the perceived value of that attention drops. Not because you are less worthy, but because scarcity is one of the primary psychological triggers the human brain uses to calculate value. This is not manipulation when it comes from authenticity. It becomes manipulation only when someone fakes scarcity to control another person, playing games, pretending not to care while secretly being desperate, or using silence as a weapon. But when scarcity comes from genuine self-respect, from truly having a full life, real boundaries, and real standards, it is not a trick. It is simply the natural result of being a person who does not hand out approval indiscriminately. Let's talk about the identity piece of this, because it goes deeper than most people realize. Every person carries an internal narrative about who they are. Confident, intelligent, funny, capable, attractive, successful, whatever the specific traits are, that narrative is the lens through which they interpret the entire world. When someone gently challenges that narrative, even in something small like disagreeing with an opinion, not laughing at a joke that wasn't actually funny, or simply not reacting with excessive enthusiasm to something they said, it creates what psychologists call an identity gap. The person is forced even if only subconsciously, to reconcile the difference between how they see themselves and how this new person seems to be perceiving them. And here is the fascinating part. Rather than walking away from that discomfort, most people lean into it. They want to close the gap. They want to prove the narrative right. They want validation from precisely the person who did not give it to them freely. This is why people become far more invested in earning approval from someone who is selectively warm than from someone who is warm to everyone equally. Selective warmth signals discernment, and discernment signals value. Think about it this way. If a person compliments absolutely everyone, their compliments become like background music, pleasant, but meaningless. But if a person is warm and generous, yet clearly discerning about who they respect, then their approval becomes something closer to a verdict. And human beings, at our core, crave verdicts about our own worth from people we perceive as credible judges. There is also a biological layer underneath all of this that makes it even more powerful. When the brain experiences uncertainty about a rewarding outcome, whether that reward is food, money, or social approval, dopamine release doesn't happen at a steady rate. It spikes unpredictably. And this unpredictability is what neuroscientists have found actually increases dopamine activity compared to predictable rewards. This was demonstrated clearly in research on variable reinforcement schedules, some of the earliest and most replicated findings in behavioral psychology, dating back to B.F. Skinner's work on operant conditioning. Skinner found that behavior reinforced unpredictably becomes far more persistent and compulsive than behavior reinforced every single time. This is the exact mechanism that makes slot machines so addictive, engineered deliberately around unpredictable reward timing to keep players pulling the lever long after logic says they should stop. It is the same mechanism that keeps people endlessly checking their phones for notifications, refreshing an app for no clear reason, chasing a small hit of uncertainty resolved. And it is the same mechanism at play in human relationships, where a person who is not entirely predictable, who does not respond with the exact same level of enthusiasm every single time, creates a dopamine pattern in another person's brain that feels remarkably similar to addiction. This is not something to weaponize cruelly. It is something to understand, because understanding it means you stop giving away all of your emotional energy for free, and you start allowing natural, healthy unpredictability, which really just means being a full, complex person with your own moods, your own standards, and your own life to do what it naturally does. Here's where this becomes deeply practical, and where you'll start recognizing this pattern in your own life immediately. Think about the moments when you felt most drawn to someone. It probably wasn't during a conversation where they agreed with everything you said and showered you with compliments. It was probably in a moment where they surprised you. Maybe they teased you gently instead of complimenting you outright. Maybe they didn't text back immediately, not out of coldness, but because they genuinely had a full life outside of you. Maybe they held an opinion you didn't expect and defended it with calm confidence instead of backing down the moment you pushed back. In each of these cases, your brain registered something important. This person has their own internal world. This person is not desperate for my approval. This person's ego is not entirely dependent on how I react to them. And paradoxically, that independence is what made them magnetic. People are not drawn to those who need them. People are drawn to those who want them, but do not need them, because wanting signals genuine interest, while needing signals scarcity of self-worth and scarcity of self-worth. Even though it seems like it should invite closeness, actually triggers something closer to psychological retreat. This shows up outside of romance too, which is part of why it's so worth understanding deeply rather than dismissing as just a dating trick. Think about friendships. The friend everyone actually confides in isn't usually the one who agrees with every decision you make, no matter how questionable. It's the friend who will tell you the truth, who has opinions of their own, who won't just mirror whatever you say back to you. Think about mentors. The ones who shape people's entire careers are almost never the ones who praised everything indiscriminately. They're the ones who saw potential and were honest enough, sometimes uncomfortably honest, to push someone toward it. Human beings across every kind of relationship consistently respect and gravitate toward people who hold their own center of gravity, and consistently, if unconsciously, lose interest in people who orbit entirely around someone else's approval. This is also deeply tied to attachment theory, one of the most well-researched areas in relationship psychology. People with secure attachment styles, the healthiest and most stable pattern of relating to others, are consistently found to be the most attractive long-term partners, specifically because they do not collapse under emotional pressure. They can tolerate a partner disagreeing with them. They do not need constant reassurance. They have a strong enough internal sense of identity that a small ego bruise does not send them spiraling into anxiety or anger. And fascinatingly, research on attraction has found that people are often initially drawn to secure, slightly challenging behavior, even if their own attachment style is anxious. Because deep down, the nervous system recognizes stability as safety, even when stability shows up disguised as someone who isn't afraid to hold their ground. This is why healthy confidence reads as attractive across almost every culture and every era of recorded human behavior. It has nothing to do with arrogance. It has everything to do with an intact sense of self that does not require constant external repair. And this matters because a lot of people confuse confidence with arrogance when really they sit on opposite ends of the same spectrum. Arrogance is loud because it's compensating for something underneath. Real confidence is quiet because it isn't performing for anyone. It's simply present, unaffected by whether the room notices it or not. Now let's bring this back to the core idea, because I want you to walk away from this video with something you can actually use. Not just something interesting to think about. When you refuse to inflate someone's ego constantly, when you allow small moments of respectful disagreement, when you don't rush to fill every silence with reassurance, and when you maintain your own standards even when it would be easier to bend them, you are not manipulating anyone. You are simply refusing to erase yourself. And in that refusal, something remarkable happens. The other person's brain, wired by millions of years of evolution to value what is uncertain, what is earned, and what requires effort, begins to engage far more deeply than it ever would with someone who offered unconditional approval from day one. This is why so many people who are endlessly kind, endlessly agreeable, and endlessly available often find themselves overlooked, while people who hold firm boundaries, who have their own opinions, and who occasionally, gently, respectfully challenge the people around them become the ones others cannot stop thinking about. Let's slow down here for a moment, because I think it's worth naming something a lot of people feel but rarely say out loud. If you've spent years being the agreeable one, the one who smooths things over, who compliments first, who apologizes even when you're not entirely sure what you did wrong, this video might be landing in a strange, uncomfortable way right now. Maybe it's making you replay old relationships, old friendships, moments where you gave everything freely and somehow still ended up feeling less valued than people who gave far less. That discomfort is worth sitting with, not because you did anything wrong by being kind. Kindness is not the problem here, but because somewhere along the way, kindness got confused with self-erasure, and those are not the same thing. You can be deeply kind and still hold a boundary. You can be warm and still have standards. You can care about someone and still not rearrange your entire identity around securing their approval. In fact, the version of you that does hold those boundaries is very likely the version of you other people respect the most, even if it takes them a while to realize why. But I want to be honest with you about something, because this video would be incomplete without saying it clearly. None of this works, not really, not in a way that builds something real and lasting, if it is used as a manipulation tactic rather than an expression of genuine self-respect. If you try to fake confidence while secretly being needy underneath, people can sense it, because human beings are remarkably good at detecting incongruence between words and underlying emotional energy. This has been demonstrated repeatedly in research on nonverbal communication and microexpressions, the tiny, often unconscious signals in tone, posture, and timing that betray what someone actually feels beneath what they're performing. You cannot perform self-respect while secretly being desperate for approval and expect it to land the same way as someone who actually has that self-respect. People pick up on the gap, even if they can't articulate exactly what feels off. The real transformation doesn't come from learning tricks to play on someone else's ego. It comes from doing the internal work to build a life, an identity, and a sense of worth that does not depend on someone else's constant validation in the first place. When that happens naturally, the behaviors described in this video, the small disagreements, the calm confidence, the refusal to chase, the healthy unpredictability, stop being tactics, they simply become who you are. And that authenticity is the actual magnetic force. The psychology explains why it works. It does not give you permission to fake it. It's also worth saying clearly that this isn't about becoming distant, cold, or unavailable as a personality trait. Some people hear all of this and swing too far in the other direction, deciding that the answer is to withhold affection entirely, to play cold on purpose, to treat every interaction like a chess match. And that's not what secure, self-respecting behavior looks like, and honestly, it usually backfires just as badly as constant approval seeking does, because people can feel calculated coldness just as easily as they can feel desperation. The goal was never to become unavailable. The goal is to become whole enough on your own that your warmth, when you give it, actually means something, because it isn't the only currency you have to offer. A person with a full life, real interests, real friendships, real standards, doesn't need to manufacture distance to be interesting. The distance exists naturally because their entire life doesn't orbit around one person's reaction to them. So here's what I want you to take from this. The next time you feel yourself rushing to smooth over every disagreement, to compliment someone the moment there's a hint of tension, to make yourself smaller and more agreeable just to avoid the discomfort of someone possibly not liking you in that exact moment, pause. Ask yourself whether you are behaving this way because it reflects who you genuinely are, or because you are afraid of what might happen if you don't. That question alone can change the entire trajectory of how people experience you. Real connection, the kind that lasts, the kind that people think about long after a conversation ends, is never built on constant appeasement. It is built on two people who each maintain their own sense of self, who occasionally challenge each other, who don't collapse the moment there's friction, and who earn each other's respect slowly, rather than handing it over instantly and unconditionally. That is not a trick. That is not manipulation. That is simply what psychologically healthy, deeply respected connection has always looked like. Long before anyone put a scientific name to it, long before psychologists ran studies on dopamine and reinforcement schedules, long before any of this had language attached to it at all. Our grandparents' generation understood pieces of this instinctively, even without the research to back it up, because they lived in a world with less instant access to each other, where scarcity and effort were simply built into daily life by circumstance. What's changed isn't the psychology. What's changed is how easy it has become to skip past it entirely, to give everything away instantly, constantly, without ever letting the natural tension of earning connection do what it has always done for human beings. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want to know your answers. Leave it in the comments below. Have you ever noticed this pattern in your own life, a moment where someone challenging you, even gently, made you respect or want their approval more than someone who agreed with everything you said? I read every comment on these videos, and I would love to hear your story, because sometimes the best psychological insight doesn't come from research, it comes from real experience. So tell me, when has this happened to you?